and welcome to Working Title, the show where we talk about books, movies, and everything in between, except sports and politics.
Inch. I wouldn't touch you with a 39.5-foot pole.
Now, since it's our pilot episode, I thought it fitting to talk about the pilot episode of the NBC show Ordinary Joe. Wow, what a real smooth segue.
Listen to,
You're a moron.
I'm gonna be frank with you, I don't watch a lot of NBC shows. I mean, the only NBC show that I've watched is The Good Place, and when it comes to TV in general, I really only watch anime. Occasionally a CW or ABC drama will catch my attention, mainly because I unironically love those kinds of soapy type dramas. But when I saw the trailers for Ordinary Joe, well, needless to say, I was sucked in. So I watched it. Now, as I'm writing this script, it's Wednesday, and I literally just finished the episode like 5 minutes ago. This show aired on Monday, so I'm slightly late to the train here. But I have to say, this is a really good show. I imagine you want an explanation as to why it's a good show.
yes!
Well, first, let me give you a brief synopsis of the show before we get into the episode itself. Ordinary Joe follows the life of Joe Kimbrough, played by James Wolk, mostly known as Bob Benson from Mad Men, in 3 different timelines. One where he's a famous musician, one where he is a cop, and one where he's a nurse. Now, in case you haven't seen the trailers, this show deals with the idea of how one choice can affect your entire life, which leads us into the episode itself. I should say, however, there are going to be spoilers for this episode, so if you haven't seen Ordinary Joe, I highly suggest you watch it before listening to this episode. Okay, let's finally get into the pilot.
It's about time!
We open with our titular Joe running late for his college graduation. I thought this was an NBC drama, not a magical girl anime. After he finally makes it, he bumps, literally, into Amy, played by Natalie Hay Martinez, most known as Case from Death Race. We also meet Jenny, played by Elizabeth Lail. Now, I actually recognized her when I watched the show. I only realized from what after I looked her up and realized she was Anna in Once Upon a Time. We also meet Joe's best friend Eric, played by Charlie Barnett. Now, here's where we get the choice that will lead to the 3 timelines. Joe can either go and have dinner with his family, go to the shore with his friend with benefits Jenny, or go and ask Amy on a date. Now, here's where it's going to get a little confusing because the episode switches between the 3 timelines, so I will try my best to talk about each one equally. There is something as well that I would like to talk about before we get into the timelines. The very subtle way that the show I didn't write this into the script. I genuinely can't say this for some reason. Differentiates them. The lighting is different for each one. So even if Joe isn't working, you can tell which timeline you're in. For the timeline where Joe is a musician, there's almost a red tint to the lighting. The cop timeline is tinted blue, and the nurse timeline is tinted green. I just think that is a really clever way to go about it. Now, if Joe decides to go on the date with Amy, this leads to the timeline where he becomes a musician. This section starts with Joe performing to a sold-out stadium. I'll be honest, I actually really like the song that he sings during this part. If you're familiar with the Vampire Diaries TV series, the song he sings during the musician timeline reminds me of music that was played throughout that series. After the show, we cut to the hospital with Joe and Amy as they get an ultrasound and find out that they're having twins, apparently after a while of trying. Then they go to dinner with Eric, who in this timeline is a divorced single dad. However, dinner is cut short as Joe and Amy have to go to the hospital. It isn't said explicitly that this is what happens, but it is very obvious that she had a miscarriage. It takes a lot for a movie/TV show to break me, but I actually teared up a little at this part. We're going to cut away to the next timeline now, because another part of the episode revolves around the 10-year college reunion, which I will cover at the end. If Joe decides to go to dinner with his family, this leads to him becoming a cop. While on duty at a rally for Congressman Bobby Diaz, where someone is going to shoot him, Cop Joe finds the shooter and shoots him before the congressman could get hurt. Were you following that? I hope so. After a dinner with his family and Eric, who works at a restaurant and invited himself, best friend things, he goes to talk to Amy, who works for the congressman, about the shooter. After the brief conversation, which doesn't help the case much, The two of them agree to go to the reunion together. Finally, if Joe decides to go to the shore with Jenny, he becomes a nurse who is married to Jenny, and the two of them have a son named Chris, who is in a wheelchair, although it isn't explained why. Nurse Joe and Jenny are currently going through a rough patch and end up filing for divorce. After Joe goes to dinner with Eric and Amy, who in this timeline are married, he decides that he doesn't want to get divorced. Now to talk about the reunion. Now, with musician Joe, him and Amy get into an argument about what if they end up never having kids. And Joe goes to the reunion alone, where he performs and runs into Jenny, who he hasn't spoken to in 10 years. While at the reunion, Jenny reveals that she wanted to meet Joe at the shore, or to tell him that she was pregnant. She ended up having the baby and giving him up for adoption. With Cop Joe, him and Amy go to the reunion together, and at the end of the night, they run into Jenny, who introduces them to her son, Lucas. And finally, Nurse Joe, who goes to a reunion and dances with Jenny. After the two of them go home, this is where Joe tells Jenny that he doesn't want to get divorced, and will try and convince her to stay. Based on her reaction to this, I think a part of her wants to stay, and honestly, I'm kind of rooting for them in this timeline. So that is the pilot of Ordinary Joe. Like I said at the beginning, I really like this show. I will definitely be keeping up with it. I don't think I'm going to do a review for every episode. If there's one in particular that I want to talk about, then I will. But as it stands right now, this will be the only review of Ordinary Joe. If you haven't, I highly recommend that you watch this show. It truly has started out really well, and I'm excited to see how the show progresses in the future. So until next time, peace out.
On to the next one, bitches!